The Life Divine is Sri Aurobindo's major work of metaphysics, which was also serialized in the journal Arya, along with the interpretation of the commentary of the Kena Upanishad, which we read during the years of the First World War. Interestingly, he interpreted another major Upanishad during this period, the Isha Upanishad. This concise Upanishad of just 18 verses is central to his own system and objectives in many ways. Like the Kena Upanishad, he began interpreting the Isha Upanishad quite early after his return to India and wrote a number of drafts towards a commentary on it. This continued into the period of the writing of the articles for the Arya. The penultimate versions of his commentary on the Isha Upanishad were titled by him The Life Divine. When he started serializing his texts for the Arya, he decided to write an eponymous commentary for the Isha Upanishad and a separate text on his metaphysics titled now The Life Divine. As one may expect, the central themes of the Isha Upanishad, as he saw it, feature prominently in the Life Divine. Before our consideration of the 2 chapters for this week's reading, it may be instructive to consider the central theme of this Upanishad and how its marks appear in the 2 chapters for our consideration. The Isha Upanishad introduces 2 important Upanishadic terms, Vidya and Avidya. These terms are literally translated as knowledge and ignorance. Thus, one may suspect that this text deals with epistemology. This is true, but in Sri Aurobindo's interpretation, these epistemological categories are fundamentally ontological and equivalent with being and becoming, or monism and pluralism, respectively. A state of monism, which is self-conscious, knows itself by identity. But in a state of pluralism, where there are multiple beings, each sentient being knows itself by self-evidence or identity, but knows its others only by inference through an apparatus of sentience. The former is considered a state of knowledge, and the latter a state of ignorance by the Upanishads. In other words, to the Upanishads, true knowledge is knowledge by identity. Knowledge by inference, such as is normal to us in our dealings with the world, is considered an ignorance. However, the Upanishad asserts that true knowing is not exclusive knowledge either of monism, the knowledge, or pluralism, the ignorance. Each by itself is a state of darkness, according to the Upanishad, and the 2 states must be known together, quote, as both in one, unquote. And it provides a pointer in this direction with the initiating lines of the Upanishad, that each of the many in the pluralism is inhabited in its depths and center by the one of the monism. This state of being is asserted in a Trinitarian formula, which is stated in the Upanishad and summarized by Sri Aurobindo in chapter 10. Quote, translated in our way of consciousness, this becomes the triple knowledge thus formulated in the Upanishad. He who sees all existences in the self, he who sees the self in all existences, he in whom the self has become all existences. Inclusion, indwelling, and identity, unquote. The 2 chapters for our consideration deal with the ontology, epistemology, and psychology of this experience. As you may notice, the Life Divine is divided into 2 books, and the chapters for our consideration may be found in Book 2, titled The Knowledge and the Ignorance, the Spiritual Evolution. The background of the Isha Upanishad is evident in this title. This book is again divided into two parts, and our chapters fall into the first of these, titled The Infinite Consciousness and the Ignorance, pointing to the pluralism and the experience of a paradoxical oneness, one and infinite at the same time within it. For our consideration, we will look at chapter 13 first and chapter 10 after. Chapter 13, Exclusive Concentration of Consciousness Force and the Ignorance, deals with the ontology of our state of experience, and chapter 10, Knowledge by Identity and Separative Knowledge, deals with the epistemology that follows from this ontology and the psychology relevant to the experience of the state of desired knowledge. This state may be characterized by the formula pluralism is equal to monism. It may be noted that Deleuze and Guattari use the same formula, pluralism is equal to monism, to describe what they call the plane of immanence, the indeterminate or groundless ground which becomes determined in individualizations in time and space. In developing his ontology in chapter 13, Sri Aurobindo starts by asserting an absolute radically infinite being, Brahman of the Upanishads, which in its universal manifestation is both one and many, the two aware of each other and contained in each other. From this he derives the state of ignorance as a partial consciousness of exclusive concentration. In a series of logical moves, he points to the ignorance as a consequence of an exclusive self-concentration of consciousness force, not an essential property of being. He posits a generalized property of concentration of consciousness, which may be considered a self-affection of infinite being. A self-affection implies consciousness, and Brahman as infinite conscious being is characterized as Sat Chit Ananda, or a Trinitarian complex of being, consciousness and bliss. It should be noted that Sri Aurobindo uses very few Sanskrit terms in these chapters, since his audience is the modern international reader. But a few such terms from Vedantic vocabulary do make their appearance in these texts. Satchidananda is one of these terms. Sat here is being, Chit is consciousness, and Ananda is bliss. This is important to note, since from this identification it follows that consciousness is not an emergent property of sentience or thought in Sri Aurobindo's metaphysics, but a fundamental essence of all existence. Matter, for example, which Sri Aurobindo assimilates to the principle of inconscience, is not bereft of consciousness, but a state of absorption of consciousness in seemingly habitual operations. Ananda as bliss is the intrinsic affect of infinite being, the subjective quality of absolute freedom. Another Sanskrit term that Sri Aurobindo uses occasionally in place of its translation concentration is tapas. Consciousness, chit, may be latent and diffuse in being, sat, or it may be active as a power of concentration, chit tapas, creating modes of being. Sri Aurobindo refers to three primary modes which are the result of such operations of concentration: the state of monism, the universal state of pluralism, and the individual states of pluralism. These could be thought of as analogous to the transcendental ideas of Kant, God, world, and soul, respectively. While for Kant, these ideas can never be experienced but are implicit to experience and hence the regulative ideas of cognition, for Sri Aurobindo, since they are held together as states of concentration of consciousness, they can be known by identity of consciousness. Since consciousness is consciousness of being, these are states of simultaneous self-consciousness of being, which is capable of multiple self-concentration. Such a simultaneity of multiple self-concentration would itself be a state of consciousness, to which Sri Aurobindo gives the name supermind to translate the Upanishadic term Vijnana. In such a state, being is equally the self of God and world and soul, so that an existence in such a state implies the Trinitarian affirmation of the Isha Upanishad that we encountered earlier. He who sees all existences in the self, he who sees the self in all existences, he in whom the self has become all existences. Inclusion, indwelling, and identity. In such a state, the one, the multiple, and the many are independent existences that can know all other existences by identity of self. But apart from such a state of multiple self-concentration, each of these existences as an independent exclusive self-concentration can exclude other existences, centered in its own reality. Such a state of consciousness is that of mind. Exclusive concentration of consciousness in the one results in the pure monism of absolute transcendence. Exclusive concentration of consciousness in a world or cosmos results in a passage through gradation of degrees to a self-oblivion of consciousness. This appearance of self-oblivion is the inconscient or matter, the inverse of the absolute transcendent within which infinite consciousness becomes immanent or latent for an evolutionary working, actualizing graded fields of multiplicity for the play of the one in and as the many. The degrees of self-concentration leading to self-absorption may be thought of as analogous to the degrees of difference of Bergson's memory cone. Each gradation may be actualized in a line of consciousness, rather in a line of evolution, according to an ascent of the human and beyond. I read that sentence again. Each gradation may be actualized in a line of evolution ascending to the human and beyond. Emergent modes of consciousness in this evolution in matter include the consciousnesses of life and mind. The manifestation of individuals at each scale partake of the exclusive concentration at that gradation of consciousness, individuating its capacities for establishing a field of experience in its type and for survival as an individual. These include capacities of sentience, such as sensation, feeling, cognition, and volition, through an apparatus of organs for the purpose. As with Bergson and Deleuze, for Sri Aurobindo, the human includes capacities of consciousness that can accelerate evolution by opening up gradations of consciousness below and above its characteristic rung and moving towards the full self-possession of multiple self-concentration as in the plane of supermind. For a plurality of beings to realize this state would be the foundation of a divine life, according to Sri Aurobindo, which is the subject matter of this book, The Life Divine. Sri Aurobindo sees such a manifestation of plurality as leading to the realization of a play of bliss or ananda, the third term of the trinity of existence. The ontology dealt with in chapter 13 prepares us for the epistemology of chapter 10, which is particularly germane to our study of intuition. If chapter 13 provides us with a metaphysical ontology, chapter 10 begins in a more phenomenological vein, analyzing the kinds of knowledge available to us in terms of experience and relating these to the ontology just described. As we have already seen, the epistemology proper to supermind is a knowledge by identity. However, in our state of isolated, separate concentration of consciousness, the only knowledge by identity that we experience is our essential and self-evident knowledge of our own existence. Our knowledge of other existences is an indirect knowledge by outer contact. At the same time, our self-knowledge of subjective states include an intimate knowledge by inner contact, and our outer experiences based on a separative knowledge by outer contact can include, behind its operation, an intuition by separative direct contact. We may bring to mind here the 4 operations of intuition that Sri Aurobindo had discussed in his commentary on the Kena Upanishad: Vigyana, Pragyana, Samgyana, and Agyana. These operations originate in supermind, which, as we have seen in Sri Aurobindo's coined term for Upanishadic Vijnana. In other words, the essential mode of being of supermind is the knowledge consciousness of Vijnana, a knowledge by identity of itself and all modes of being experienced as self-existences, internal or external to it. The other 3 operations of knowledge are in fact operations of Vijnana, drawing back to apprehend its own states as a form of intimate direct contact in Pragyana, operating as direct sense contact between separated existences in Samgyana, and as a volitional intuition between separated existences in Agyana. In terms of our experience of knowledge in the evolving ignorance, according to chapter 10, our self-evident experience of self-existence is an intimation of Vijnana. Our experience of knowledge through direct contact of subjective states could be equated to Pragyana. Our knowledge through direct intuitive contact with other existences could be equated with Samgyana. Our dynamic knowledge of action through will and skill could be equated with Agyana, while our indirect knowledge through the apparatus of sense and reason could be equated with Agyana or ignorance. This would be an epistemology of ignorance painted in broad strokes. Considered more closely, however, we find that the emergent modes of consciousness of life in matter and mind in living matter each operate at every level in our being. Thus, when discussing the intuitive knowledge by direct separative contact, Sri Aurobindo refers to 3 modes of mental intuition received through the senses, such as intuitions of the sense mind, the life or vital mind, and the cognitive or perceptive mind. The sense mind receives sense impressions. The vital mind receives energy images, and the cognitive mind receives idea images. These are related to the three gods, Indra of the mind, Vayu of life, and Agni of the body, senses, in the Kena Upanishad. The fractal operation of all three in each of the modes of consciousness is being acknowledged here and needs to be considered for an integral knowledge in each of the operations of knowledge. In this chapter, Sri Aurobindo also develops his psychology of knowledge, serving the objective of a transformation of the indirect knowledge by external contact to a knowledge by identity through the intermediate development of intuitive knowledge, characterized by the two forms of knowledge by direct contact. Our physical existence, as has been developed by the evolution of matter and characterized by the mental apparatus of indirect or inferential knowledge, is identified for this purpose as the surface being. The surface being includes surface operations of the three modes of emergent consciousness: an outer physical body, a surface vital, and a surface mental. Behind the surface being is our deeper subjective existence, identified by Sri Aurobindo as the subliminal being, and sometimes the inner being. The subliminal being includes more concealed operations of the physical, vital, and mental consciousness, identified here as the subtle physical, the inner vital, and the inner mental. At the depths of the subliminal being is the psychic entity or soul, along with the psychic personality or psychic being, the individuating essence of each being as a self-becoming of being through its exclusive self-concentration of consciousness in individual forms. Sri Aurobindo uses the term Purusha to refer to this inner psychological center. It should be noted that there is some ambiguity about the use of this term Purusha. When discussing the entry into the subliminal being, Sri Aurobindo writes about the replacement of the ego or mental cogito by the Purusha as the center of a deeper self-existence. But this deeper center can be either the self of the inner mind or the psychic entity. Writing of the action of the physical, vital, and mental forces in the transition from the surface to the subliminal being, he says, quote, "But while on the surface their action is mixed together, confused and conflicting, here in our depths they can be seen and worked upon in their independent and separate nature and action, and a harmonization of them by the mental being in us, leader of the life and body, or better, by the central psychic entity, is not so difficult, provided we have the right psychic and mental will in the endeavor." Unquote. He later identifies this center as the Purusha. The term Purusha makes its appearance in Indian esoteric literature in the 10th book of the Rig Veda, where it stands for a supreme person. In later literature, this person is gendered, male, but in its inception, it is more properly translated just as person. Later in the schools of Sankhya and Yoga, it is equated with the mental witness or inactive and uninfluenced being of the mental consciousness. In Sri Aurobindo's psychology, there is such a being to each of the emergent grades of consciousness in each individual. That is, a physical Purusha, a vital Purusha, and a mental Purusha. Behind all these is the psychic Purusha or psychic entity, an individuation through self-concentration of being as person or Purusha. What Sri Aurobindo means by the transition of the center to the Purusha in the subliminal being is either the psychic entity or a successive transition from the mental Purusha to the psychic being. He warns against the mistaking of the vital ego with this Purusha. The subliminal being overpasses the limits of the personal or psychological and is porous to the cosmic or transpersonal consciousness. As I understand it, the subliminal being is analogous to the virtual of Bergson and Deleuze. Beyond the subliminal being and behind the psychic being is the being itself, with its multiple self-concentration, becoming the cosmos and all its individuals. This is the proper domain of Vijnana or supermind, with its knowledge by identity, Vijnana, and its three subsidiary operations of Pragyana, Samjnana, and Ajnana. The epistemological project of Sri Aurobindo is to transition from the indirect knowledge by external contact to the knowledge by identity of the supermind through the intermediate normalization of the internal and separate forms of knowledge by direct contact. This is achieved by a transition from the surface being to the supramental being through the subliminal being, and a substitution of the center of individual existence from the personal ego to the psychic being, transiting through the mental Purusha, and thence to the supramental being in alignment with the psychic being. We may relate this to the terminology of the Kena Upanishad. The form of knowledge of the surface being belongs to the constructed reality of the elements of nature, bhuta, grounded in matter, thus adhibhautika. The intuitive forms of knowledge of the subliminal being belong to the realm of the cosmic powers or gods, deva, and are hence of the gods, adhidaivika. While the transcendental form of knowledge by identity belongs to the psychic being and in its origin to the divine Purusha, person, or Atman, self, and is hence known as self-knowledge, Adhyatmika. The chapter outlines the nature of the transition necessary for this transformation of knowledge. In conclusion, we may address the question of why Sri Aurobindo is not more explicit about specific methods to follow for these three transitions. Firstly, he is primarily interested in outlining his project so that we have a clear understanding of the stakes, and these may awaken a goal of becoming in us. It is his belief that a goal of becoming precedes praxis. The more conscious a goal of becoming, the clearer the means, upaya, that develop of themselves. This may be related to Bergson's and Deleuze's premise that the statement of a problem of belonging, of becoming, carries with it the field of its actualizations, which manifest creatively under spatio-temporal conditions. Secondly, as with the Upanishads, Sri Aurobindo practices a contemplative philosophy, holding the assumption that the knowledge being given is already known by each of us, but hidden behind the surface in our subliminal and psychic depths. Sri Aurobindo believes in the power of language to intensify a contemplation of the mind which knocks on the doors of this hidden knowledge and activates it in each individual. In its awakening, the knowledge itself dictates the means of its discovery and normalization in our transformed surface being. This returns us to individual agency in self transformation and a creative spirituality for our entry into a subjective age of postmodernity.